We've been talking about Heidegger's analysis of being towards death in his major work, Being in Time. And, you might recall that one of the interesting parts of his analysis is this tension that runs right through Being in Time between authentic being, or authenticity generally, and inauthenticity. Now, scholars have noted that we shouldn't necessarily think of this in normative terms, that these are just ways in which Dasein is in the world. So remember, this is the basic structure or the basic meaning of having a self, is that one is openness to the world, one is always already in the world, before we are nature and nurture and all the categories that follow from that. So one of the really intriguing questions that comes out of Heidegger's study of death is how does authenticity play into this? Does death kind of axiomatically make it an authentic experience? Well, Heidegger says no, and in a very interesting passage, he says Dasein has its death of the kind appropriate to anything that lives, and it has not an ontical isolation, that is not as an empirical fact, but as co-determined by its primordial kind of being, which more on this later. But here's the line that I want to draw your attention to. Insofar as this is the case, Dasein too can end without authentically dying. We designate this kind of inauthentic orientation towards dying demise. So demise you can think of as, again, that bifurcated category between authenticity and inauthenticity. Demise falls under the general sway or the general take that Heidegger makes between the they self of average everydayness and authentic being towards death, which he'll tell us what that actually means. But the emphasis really should be placed on the they self, and the reason for this is because so much of what he has to say really hinges on that. Can one be wrested from the power of the they self of average everydayness? And we also have to pay attention to this very kind of complicated structure of the they self for another reason, and that's historically these passages in Being in Time had a huge footprint on Western political philosophy, most especially that of Herbert Marcuse, and to a lesser extent, but perhaps in a more nuanced way, with Hannah Arendt. One of the interesting things about Marcuse's analysis of one-dimensional society is that it's so devastating in its critique, so overwhelming, that one of the criticisms of it is that, you read that and you say, well, why would anyone even bother doing anything? It's just, such a formidable category that has to be overcome. And so, but the roots of this kind of perspective from below, if you will, that Marcuse and Heidegger are working with, is the view from existence itself, that existence becomes flattened under the sway of the they self in the case of Marcuse. In the case of Heidegger, the they self becomes idle talk, and one can just have phrases that take the place of genuine engagement with oneself and one's openness towards the world. So how does it happen that we do become authentic? And is death the sine qua non for this? Sartre had an interesting kind of riff with Heidegger. Heidegger was very intrigued with Sartre's work when it came out. I imagine, especially his Being in Nothingness and Nausea. But Sartre, in his account of kind of similar human phenomenon, namely this kind of fallenness and I guess what some could call false consciousness generally. Uh, his hero, Antoine Roquentin, in the novel Nausea, doesn't come to an authentic view of his life by way of an awareness of death. It comes organically through his existence. And he was kind of critical of Heidegger when it came to the issue of being towards death, believing that death really doesn't offer us anything whatsoever. It's just part of the structure of life, the kind of existential nothingness that, to a certain extent, defines us. But in Heidegger, you see, death plays a huge role because it has the potential to wrest us from the power of the they self. So we can become authentic if we orient or allow ourselves to be oriented towards death in a genuine way. So how does he work this out? Well, he talks about the possibility that one can kind of engage with death in such a way that it opens up horizons of life. So, to a certain extent, it's not necessarily, a novel view. I think novelists and the Greek tragedy writers have delved into this before. But Heidegger's idea is different now. He's going to introduce the idea that with the structure of death now a part of our life, we have the potential to recognize that there's no there underneath our feet, that this category of death, this experience of death, which we know is there, and we know that it's going to remove all our possibilities, opens up the horizon, you see. Now, the horizon has been largely hidden from us because of our concernful solicitude, our busy work with the world, papers that need to be moved and shuffled, people that have their phone calls returned and what have you, all of this sort of stuff. So, but what it does for us is it puts us in touch with the fact that we live not in a box, or as later he'll say, a world picture. We live in an open horizon. As Herbert Dreyfus said, we are, like a head open to the world with this horizon. But what death does is it kind of reformats, if you will, our situation, and we see now that we live in a horizon and not in a structure. So if you can think about the experience, I used to go to a place up in Maine called Goose Rocks Beach, and in the winter the expanse was just so magnificent. It just went on forever, and it seemed like the sky just came right down to the horizon. And if you compare that experience of this vast openness, where everything kind of stands out, with the experience of being indoors or in a city or something, which has its own virtues, of course, you can see kind of what Heidegger's getting at. The experiential topography is much different when one is open and talking about a horizon. Filmmakers knew this, of course. One of the wonderful techniques that Alfred Hitchcock, the director, employed was this kind of forced perspective, where using the camera he would set the individual larger than life against the horizon. You get this sense of openness and possibility. And so that's what Heidegger wants us to think about. And so what death does to us is it puts us in touch with the horizon of our world. Now, there are distinctions that need to be made between my world and their world, but let's just stick with this concept of the horizon and what death does to our thinking about being towards death. He asks a question. He says, death is Dasein's own most possibility. Death towards this possibility discloses to Dasein its own most potentiality for being, in which its very being is an issue. Here, he writes, it can become manifest to Dasein, human being, that in this distinctive possibility of its own self, it has been wrenched away from the they. in quotes. This means that in anticipation, key word there, anticipation, any Dasein can have wrenched itself away from the they already. But when one understands that this is something which Dasein can have done, this only reveals its factual lostness in the everydayness of the they self. Okay, so when we get in touch with the anticipation of death, we recognize that, oh, all along I had this openness. And for Heidegger, that's pretty profound. Later on, he'll say, this makes manifest that all being alongside the things with which we concern ourselves, that's kind of busy work stuff, will fail us when our own most potentiality for being is an issue. Dasein can be authentically itself only if it makes this possible for itself of its own accord. Okay, so he's departing from others who think that, say, the fog of war and seeing other people die, will, give one a different view of reality. Again, for Heidegger, this has to be something that one brings upon oneself. Now, he introduced earlier this idea of anticipation. And here he writes that anticipation discloses to existence that its uttermost possibility lies in giving itself up, and thus it shatters all its tenaciousness to whatever existence one has reached. Those are very powerful words here. In a lot of religious traditions, you see this kind of notion that, oftentimes we have a tendency to grab onto things and hold on to things and people and situations desperately almost. And Heidegger argues we have to give up